borrowing money to gamble, essentially. That's not prudent management, and that's what worries me, because that will limit future governments, because the more in debt you go, it means your interest payments are higher. Again, all these announcements have a price tag. I want to see what the bottom line is. It sounds like they're expecting $100 billion price tag on the next budget.
Lydia Miljan is a respected political scientist and author. For years, she studied the mechanisms of power. Now she's issuing a warning she never thought she'd have to make about her own country. A warning about the quiet, incremental steps that can change a nation forever. Sometimes this process is swift, as in Germany in 1933.
That's sort of a really sneaky way of doing it, and they're no longer independent. Are we going to be afraid that the government's going to say we can't have these conversations? And it grants the federal government and essentially the Prime Minister the power to override existing laws and regulations for projects deemed in the so-called national interest. I would give them a failing grade on that, but that is incomplete. That's where you get the slow erosion of rights.
How far away are we from this level that I call the comparative decline compared to a total collapse?
The Nazi one's an easy one. They were more incremental. Got to be wary of these incremental abuses of power.
The last time we were talking here, the last question I asked you was how you were feeling about the future of Canadian politics and Canada generally. And your reply was I should ask you after the elections. So it's past the elections right now, and I thought, why don't we start from there before we dig into your recent articles that you've written after then?
Yeah, I guess I was more optimistic during election, and in part because I think we did need change of government. And while initially the Carney government said and did sort of the right things, they made the right noises, so far they really haven't lived up to their expectations. I mean, we still have a significant problem with the cost of living. I just went to the grocery store, and it's like I bought 3 things and it cost me $60. I wasn't buying hugely decadent things. It was just, some sausage, and some cheese, but like that. So I think, people struggle, and the struggle is real when it comes to that. As was the case with the other government, they love to announce big things. Carney loves these offices. So he's got the Office of Major Projects, and then more recently, he's just announced this Housing Accelerator Office. And the announcement was that they were going to build modular homes. And actually, I did a little interview on CBC, and I was being a bit facetious saying, well, let's hope they're not going to have leaky roofs. But my bigger point was, do we really want government in the business of building houses? We know that they have failed with respect to Indigenous people, where that is their responsibility to provide houses. And I think, Indigenous communities that don't have clean drinking water, that have substandard housing, don't reflect well on the federal government's ability to deliver that. Since then, I actually learned more about this housing announcement, and it's got a big price tag with very few houses. And again, it's just rolling out, but the first rollout is 4,000 houses, and I forget the big number of what they have attached to that. But essentially, if it was just those 4,000 houses, each house would cost like $3 million, and these are supposed to be affordable homes. So there's a disconnect there. So how much is the housing accelerator going towards actually building quality homes that Canadians want to live in? Or are they just going to be providing another level of bureaucracy that essentially provides substandard or really low quality houses for a small subset of the population? So that worries me a lot, because we know these big government programs, it's hard to get rid of them once they've established, especially if you're creating an office and all those infrastructure. And it also suggests to me that they don't understand the nature of the problem. One of the things that government can do to help in the housing sector is actually reduce the barriers that governments put in. There's lots of development charges that are put in, lots of other hoops that developers have to put through to get a house built. And I don't know if this office does that. I don't know if just giving a contract to a private company to provide pre-built houses is necessarily what Canadians want, or necessarily value for dollar. So that I'm a bit concerned about. I mean, their big projects list so far has most of the premiers on side. So that's, I guess, something I'm optimistic about, but it's not as ambitious as he claimed it to be. And personally, I want to see pipelines. I want to see pipeline capacity built. I think it's irresponsible for Canadians who have so much oil reserves, who have a cleaner environmental record than other countries, to be importing oil, especially on the East Coast, from countries with not as great records. So that's problematic. We're sort of, in a sense, harming ourselves by not developing our own oil and gas sector to the extent that it has. So there's my mixed view of the future and the present.
So that's about domestic policy. What about geopolitics? Because I think there is a huge promise that they had leading up to the election. We remember the elbows up rhetoric just before the election. But how do you rate geopolitics and foreign policies generally?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. I'm not an expert on international relations. So, like the war stuff, you're going to have to go to some of my colleagues for that because I shouldn't talk about the war in Palestine or Ukraine. That's sort of outside my remit. Trade, though, is more part of what I can speak to. Again, I'm not particularly impressed with the record so far. Remember that during the election, Mark Carney said that he was singularly equipped to deal with Donald Trump, that the tariffs were an existential crisis. And as you said, elbows up. I mean, again, tell me that you're not going to do a slogan by doing a slogan. And it hasn't been elbows up. We have shown, or at least he has shown, that he is willing to capitulate on things that he said he wasn't going to. I mean, the digital service tax, for example. I don't mind that they got rid of the retaliatory tariffs because I think tariffs are bad to begin with. So, certainly when the Americans got rid of their tariffs on CUSMA compliant products, it made sense for us to do the same. So I don't have a criticism about that. But I do have a criticism about the fact that we haven't resolved the aluminum and steel tariffs. We haven't resolved the auto tariffs. And so that's on the US side. And so we wonder whether or not we're just going to have this big trade irritant until Trump goes away. And maybe we don't want to renegotiate CUSMA while Trump's in the office, or at least until after the midterms to see whether or not some of his power goes down so that we have more bargaining chips. Ed Carney seems to be really focused on Europe as a trading partner. But again, I don't know if that makes economic sense given that the billions of dollars we trade with the United States can't be that easily shifted to a European market. If it was easy to trade with Europe, we would have been trading with Europe. The fact remains, the border's right there. We're an integrated market. We don't have language barriers. It is very easy to trade with Americans. Though today, Carney's supposedly going to Mexico to craft a bilateral trade agreement with the Mexicans, which I think is fine because that would put pressure on America. But again, and it could be that Carney overpromised and now he runs the risk of under delivering. He said he's going to have a trade deal by July 27th. It's gone. And that's the U.S. side of things. The other thing that I think is even probably more scary, especially, and it depends on what sector you're in, but the farmers in Western Canada are feeling really hard hit by the tariffs from China. So China's imposed a 100% tariff on our canola producers. And so Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe did go to China to negotiate something, but it's not for the premier of a province to be negotiating with the Chinese state. It really is something that the federal government has to do. And they've been very quiet on that front. So on our elbows up trading, so far, we haven't seen very much in terms of results.
Wow, that's a long list. Maybe on the bright side, maybe I should ask you, what has this government done well so far?
I don't know because I don't have a budget. All I have is a lot of very extensive announcements. I have a prime minister who is, as I said, going to Europe several times. Now he's going to Mexico. He's making lots of announcements, lots of spending commitments. They did promise that they were going to invest more and spend less. And when directly asked about what he was going to cut, he just gave a list to the opposition leader what he was going to invest more in. So again, all these announcements have a price tag. I want to see what the bottom line is. It sounds like, from what we've been hearing, that they're expecting $100 billion price tag on the next budget in November. And that is not sustainable. Again, Carney came in with the resume saying he was a banker, he knew finance, and he was going to stop the excessive spending that had happened under the previous Liberal government of Justin Trudeau. And there's no indication that he's doing that. In fact, it looks like he's even having a higher and quicker pace of spending than the previous government. And that worries me a lot because, as we know, the more you spend, the more in debt you go. Like, he can say they're investments, but my very simple way of understanding finance is When you're spending, that's when you're going into debt. When you're investing, you invest with your savings. You don't borrow money to invest. I was told early in my life that you do not borrow money to play the stock market. You use your savings that you can afford to lose to go into those investments, but you don't put in things that you think that you can't afford to lose. And so if you're borrowing money to gamble, essentially, that's not prudent management. And that's what worries me, because that will limit future governments, because the more in debt you go, it means your interest payments are higher. And we spend more servicing the debt than we do on social services, I believe. So those are the trade-offs, right? You can keep on borrowing money, but eventually you're going to run out of other people's money. And then you've got the problem of you've got to pay your interest payments first, and people aren't seeing a return on investment with that kind of investment.
That's a very interesting way to appraise the government, especially almost 5 months now in office. I hate to do this to you again. I've done it in the past. Would you grade them so far? You're a prof?
Yeah, so I mean, again, Carney, I do like the way he speaks, because he sort of speaks in the policy language that I can understand. And he said, again, a couple weeks ago, I don't want objectives, I want results. But the thing is, objectives are the way in which you measure your results. So my objective for him would be to find a pathway to balanced budget. So clearly we haven't seen that yet, so I'd give him a failing grade on that. If his objective was to secure a trade deal with the US, or to get rid of these tariffs, I'd give him about a C, just because we got rid of the tariffs on CUSMA related, but we haven't dealt with the steel and aluminum and the auto sector. I'd give him a failing grade on tariffs when it came to China, because they haven't done anything about it. On housing, again, making announcements isn't the same as results, so that is incomplete. And on the big projects list, again, that would be incomplete, just because we don't have shovels in the ground. A lot of the things they announced on that list were things that were already pre-approved. So that doesn't show me that there's new things in the pipeline that are going to be quickly approved and get, people working and get those projects happening. And this is part of his own problem, because he promised a lot. So I would expect that by the end of his term, in the next 3 to 4 years, that we better see some big results for all these promises. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult for them to win re-election.
What a report sheet that would be. If that was a student taking that home to parents, you're going to have to justify the payment of tuition for such report sheet. Incomplete here and there, failure, and a C. Not even a B or B plus anyway.
Oh, no, we're not in B plus territory. But having said that, in terms of popularity, not everybody agrees with me. A lot of people like them still. Like, you looked at I looked at the polls over the summer, and he was still the preferred choice of prime minister. The government was still, in very much majority territory if you translate support into seats. But that's because there's an absence of opposition during the summer. So I don't put a lot of weight into that. And again, we're not having an election now. We're having an election in several years. And so there's a lot that he can be judged on, both favorably and unfavorably.
Right. So no wonder you wrote 2 articles since the last time we talked. One of them is about democracy waning in Canada due to federal policies. And the second is about the one that you actually released just yesterday. I was lucky enough to catch it after it was released, because I was trying to just see just making sure I'm up to date with your recent publications. I hope we get time enough to dive into that one. But I think we'll at least start with the topic about democracy waning in Canada due to federal policies. The last time we were here also, I remember I was sort of raising an alarm. I don't like to sound like an alarmist, but with the trend of things, I asked you then what you thought about the way government is being run, and whether or not some of the templates that a lot of third world countries are being used out here. And I remember your reply was, well, if it was that bad, someone like Pierre Poilievre, the opposition leader in a third world country, would already be in jail. So I agree with you on that ground. We're still far, far away from a total collapse. And maybe the way I would even capture that is what we have right now is a comparative decline. I don't know if you would agree with that, because we have systems that still work. We have a bank system that works. We have a court system that works. We have infrastructure to whatever extent they still work. We have healthcare system, but it's still not the envy of many people from around the world. We have a system that many immigrants from across the world want to still come into. But you wrote here a warning. I would take it to be a warning that democracy is winning in Canada due to federal policy. I'm going to read a portion of this article just so that people can grab it and read it after. I would also tag it in the description. You said democratic backsliding often occurs not through democratic coups, but through the gradual erosion of institutions by elected leaders, presidents, and prime ministers alike, who subvert the very system that brought them into power. Sometimes this process is swift, as in Germany in 1933, but more often it unfolds slowly and almost imperceptibly. You referenced this decline, and I know you're referencing Germany in 1933 from the classic textbook on, is it textbook or book on how democracies die? That you also referenced in that article. But why do you make such an audacious claim?
Well, in part because I guess I worry about when government becomes such a big part of our society and they govern things that are outside of their area. And so, I mean, well, let's talk about the media, subsidies, for example. That's sort of because, again, everyone's attacks Donald Trump and they can legitimately attack him for always talking about fake news and delegitimizing journalists. My point in the article is that if you think about how the liberals did it, they were a lot more subversive in a way. They weren't as obvious how they did it. Trudeau gets in 2015, wonderful press, everyone loves him. He gets a minority government in 2019, sort of the honeymoon's over. And then, ironically enough, as the honeymoon's over, once he gets in 2019, he says, oh, there's a crisis in media. Let me give media some money. So he starts to subsidize the media. So we've always had a subsidized media. We've had the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which gets over $1 billion a year in subsidies. And that's not enough. And so now they start to subsidize the private sector journalists. And now the private sector is becoming more and more dependent on the government. They aren't changing their business model. They are basically saying, we need this money. And so subconsciously or consciously, it makes it much more difficult for journalists in the media that receive that to criticize the government, to be really critically evaluating them. They're no longer independent. So that's sort of a really sneaky way of doing it. And they said these were temporary. They said it was there so that they could save journalists' jobs. Well, companies that received the money didn't have to keep the jobs. In fact, many of them laid off employees, including the CBC. And now they're permanent. Like 325 million for 24-25 went to subsidize. And then Carney, during the election campaign, says, and I'm going to give you guys another 150 more. He pledged more. Right. So that becomes a campaign issue. So here you have one candidate saying, I'm going to subsidize and increase subsidies to media. And then the other leader saying, I'm not. And then if you look at the coverage between the two, some people have suggested that perhaps that's why Carney was not as critically scrutinized as was, say, Pierre Poilievre. And then there's sort of the Bill C-11, which was the bill under the previous government that wanted to extend CRTC rules for digital content. It sounded like they were going to regulate content providers like yourself, but then they realized the backlash was so great. So again, it was sneaky. They said, oh, okay, we're not going to be regulating any old podcast for speech. What we're going to do is we're going to regulate whoever you put it on. So YouTube or Google or whatever, and make them the police dogs so that they will be afraid. They have to be accountable for anything that you and I say, for example, on this podcast. So are we going to think about that when we have conversations? Are we going to be afraid that the government's going to say, well, she's being too negative towards the federal government and say we can't have these conversations? That hasn't happened yet. But in this world of contested speech, of everyone being hyper vigilant and, attacking everything you say, that's a worrisome. I'm equally worried about a bill like that in Canada that could regulate internet speech, as I am in the United States with Donald Trump's chairman of the FCC making veiled threats against ABC because of Jimmy Kimmel's comments the other day. Both are wrong. It is not up to the government to be policing legitimate criticism, legitimate commentary. We can disagree. You can disagree with me. I can disagree with you. We can agree or disagree with Jimmy Kimmel. The point is people should have the right to speak and they shouldn't be deplatformed as a result of it. And then, but even more recently, recently under this government, we have C-5, which is called the One Canadian Economy Act. And it became law on June 26th. And it grants the federal government and essentially the prime minister the power to override existing laws and regulations for projects deemed in the so-called national interest. So what's problematic about that is that anybody can define what the national interest is. And so this is now giving this government unprecedented power to micromanage major projects. And people are concerned about it. I've spoken to many Indigenous leaders, for example, who are saying, wait a minute, we work so hard on reconciliation. We work so hard on the fact that it's agreed that there's a duty to consult with us for major projects. And now it looks like you're going to just steamroll over us. And so this government's setting itself up for some battles, and we'll have to see how they deal with those. And again, we may agree or disagree on whether we should have pipelines, but they do have an obligation to consult with Indigenous people and figure out a way to move forward without necessitating using that kind of power under Bill C-5.
So you mentioned two things there already. You've talked about the media, and then you talked about the centralized federal powers. There are two more things you mentioned in that article. You talked about the detailed regulation. You also talked about that just now. And then you talked about the emergency power and judicial checks, referencing the Convoy protest of 2021. We're going to get back to that in 1 second here. But let me present a devil's advocate perspective on the two that you've touched on, or the three you've touched on already, which is media, which is regulation of speech, and digital regulation, and then centralized power. Many would argue that when government is in a crisis-prone era, like the period between the transition between Justin Trudeau's administration and the current administration, I think many people argue that that was sort of a crisis-prone era in government, because that's why we had parliament prorogation for so long, and then we had public dissatisfaction in government generally. The approval rating of that administration was terribly low. Many would argue on the other side of your argument that maybe it's a good time when government is crisis prone to actually centralize executive power so that government can have more power to execute projects and build more, do more. I don't know what you say about that.
I would say that's the exact time you don't want them to have more power, because that was a problem of their own making. So you're saying that, oh, when the people don't like me anymore, I should have more power to push through what I want to do? No, that's why we have elections. It's like they lost their mandate. They lost their credibility with the Canadian public. And so I don't care if the government has a crisis. The point is the country in crisis? And I would say it is not in crisis. Like, Justin Trudeau didn't have to resign. He could have just, the day that he resigned, he could have easily just said, you know what, I went to the Governor General, and instead of asking for prorogation, he could have asked for an election. He chose to put his party over the interests of the country. If the country were in such dire straits as they were claiming to be, then that's when we should have had the election. Instead, he said, oh, my party's in trouble, I gotta go. Here, let's stop doing all the work of government because it's such an important time. We're going to stop everything while the Liberals get their house in order, pick a new leader who will be more palatable for the Canadian public so that we can remain in power. I don't see how that is any different than some dictatorship that we've seen in other countries. I mean, that's sort of out of their playbook. We have to differentiate between a government crisis and a country in crisis. And I think all we saw was a government in crisis, and they should have less power, not more power in that, if that's the case.
But on the grounds of media, let me ask this opposing question to your perspective as well. The other side of the argument would say, do we want to platform neo-Nazis? I think the definition of such has become relative in our time as well, but that's another argument in itself. But they will say things like, do we want to platform a neo-Nazi? Do we want to give airtime to someone who makes a blatantly wrong argument or perspective? Maybe that's the reason why they believe censorship is a great idea for the safety of public discourse in the nation. I don't know what you think about that too.
So I hope it's clear, I would not want to platform a neo-Nazi group. I would not want to platform any hate speech either. But we have existing laws on that. We have hate speech provisions in our criminal code. You cannot incite violence against a group or people. The problem I see right now is it's so easy to label somebody a neo-Nazi, whether or not they are or not. And I think that, I think we have a reflection point right now with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. People said, and the person who who murdered him essentially said, I can't stand this kind of hate that he was espousing. But, the clips, and I wasn't a big follower of Charlie Kirk. I knew about him tangentially. But, since then I started seeing clips that people are putting on. And I thought they weren't hateful. He was not a neo Nazi. He was actually engaging in debates. His whole shtick was prove me wrong. He invited people to debate him. I think that's a positive thing in society. And so for people just to give him a name because they disagreed with his approach to trans rights, for example, was more damaging. And obviously it was exceptionally damaging for him. But that was because others were labeling him. And I don't want the government to be the arbiter of what is acceptable or unacceptable. I think we understand legally what hate speech is in this country, but I don't think Charlie Kirk was espousing hate speech, and nobody put him. I mean, he was in the United States, but he wasn't up on charges for anything like that. He was just having a conversation with college age students and having them critically evaluate their points of view. And the clips I saw, he was always respectful. He let people speak. They just happened to disagree with him. But just because we disagree shouldn't mean that we call each other names, because it's the calling of names. And that's why I worry that who in the government would be the ones to decide if our speech hits their criteria. What is the threshold? Because it's too easy. I mean, it's always the thing, right? In terms of logical discourse, a conversation's ended as soon as somebody brings up Hitler because they've run out of things to say, right? So, you should be able to disagree without being disagreed.
Let me follow up on that topic, actually, the topic of the assassination. And I know this is American news, but I think it relates to us here in Canada. And it relates to us on the grounds of free speech. It relates to us on the grounds of the socio-cultural environment that we built for ourselves as a nation right now. In fact, I argued in a recent reaction to that tragic event that there's only a few steps away from being an assassin on the rooftop when we've already built a system where the cancel culture thrives, where you strip people of platforms and you strip them of their academic prowess, in fact, in certain cases, or where you think, people should be banished, disenfranchised, and totally, erased from society. We're not too far from the point of becoming assassins on the rooftop. Because if you think you can easily label someone neo-Nazi, for instance, because of their point of view, then I think the immediate or the impulsive response to such is the society is actually better without that person. And I think that's the reason we've seen from different circles, albeit I think a minority of people who've actually celebrated the killing of Charlie Kirk, both here in Canada and in the United States. And I think that makes me a little worried about the future of speech generally in Canada, especially when, media platforms also, easily tag, especially, let me state it for what it is, because we've talked about this before on the podcast here. Media generally is known to be left-leaning, as much as we've also talked about this with respect to academia. Academia is equally left-leaning, hugely. There are reports that substantiates that. So if you silence especially conservative voices, classic case in this regard would be Charlie Kirk. How far away are we as Canadians from such?
It's always a threat. And I see it in terms of the rhetoric. I saw it even during the rhetoric of the election campaign, because people were attributing to the Conservative Party things that they haven't said. Even Mark Carney did that. The way he attacked Poilievre, saying that Poilievre would kneel to, to Donald Trump and things like that. It was like just made up out of whole cloth. He never provided any examples. He just basically tried to make the case that he'd be strong and his opponent be weak. And that's standard fare for election campaigns. There's as far back as Cicero. Cicero has a great quote how, you want to make yourself look good and your opponent look bad. But in terms of normal everyday speech, I mean, the people who are applauding the death of Charlie Kirk, I don't even know if they knew that much about him, except to know that he was considered on the right. And they're very imprudent going online and celebrating it and then thinking that there's not going to be consequences. I've seen lots of videos of people who are crying because they lost their jobs because wasn't in keeping with the social media policy of their companies. So there is a lot of policing outside of even government.
Can I turn your attention to the numbers on the screen for a second here? Because it shows over 90% of the regular viewers on this channel haven't subscribed yet. It goes a long way in helping us improve the quality of work, the conversation, and the guests podcast that you see on this channel every time, if you could just click the subscribe button right now, that would be very helpful to bring that number down to about 80%. Well, thank you very much. Let's get back into the conversation.
Any organization I belong to does require me to sign an attestation that I will be respectful online. That I have to be careful of what I say. And I think that that is something that increasingly people have to think about as a condition of employment, because you affect the brand of your company. And so that's something that we all have to be careful about, but equally you on both sides. So you don't celebrate the death of someone, you don't call them names, and you don't murder people. Probably the best way to go about these things. But it's the internet, even though it's been around for 30 years, we still need to learn how to use it in a way that makes sense in civil society. Typically, we don't behave in the real world the way we behave online, and that's something people have to be careful of.
Okay, so let's fall back on our conversation about democratic erosion in Canada. I think this is a very important conversation. What risk do you see, or what dangers do you sense in the immediate? And, how far away are we from, this level that I call the comparative decline compared to a total collapse? I know the 1933 Nazi government collapsed within a year, if I'm correct. I think that's because it was run under a dictator government. We are not quite under a dictatorship government. But how far away are we? It looks like you have something to say about it.
The Nazi one's an easy one. I would recommend people read How Democracies Died, because they talk about other countries and how it happened in Latin America in particular, and they weren't quite as dramatic as the Nazi regime. They were more incremental. And that's sort of what I was pointing out in the article, that you got to be wary of these incremental abuses of power and the way governments get away with it. And that's why I focus so much on the media, because, they are the fifth estate there to keep the government in check. And whenever governments go overboard in demonizing their opponents, it is a worry, because you're not having free and fair elections. I don't think there's any imminent threat, but, the increase of government in our lives is something we should be worried about. We should be worried about their propensity to continue to spend money and continue to increase their share of the economy. $100 billion projected budget coming up worries me, because that's more government. And we need to sort of move away thinking that government is the answer to all our problems. Certainly, there's things that we can do collectively. And I think we have consensus on that. There's obviously roads and schools and things like that. But think about just all the additional props the government said, right? So my way of thinking of it is we have a cost of living crisis. And I believe the cost of living crisis was because the government caused it, in part because of the COVID. Are we stuck? Right? In part because of sort of the COVID surge, right? They overspent during COVID, but then they continue to spend after that. And so that raised the price. And you think about the carbon tax, there's a bunch of things that raise the price of goods. So my simple mind would be, okay, maybe we should have less government so that the price can go down. No, what does the government do? They invest heavily in childcare. So they're spending more money on that. They start to do pharmacare. Again, great to pay for people's drugs, but there's a cost of that. Dental care. And then school food programs. And now housing. So all of these things are government encroachments. And they're saying that they can do better for us than we can do for ourselves. And so that's where you get the slow erosion of price. I was listening to CBC the other day, and they said that for all the millions that they're spending on the food program, each child only gets the equivalent of 9 cents a day for food. So it's like, well, what are they going to buy with 9 cents a day? Like, how is that helping anything? It makes toggles the mind. Like, why are we spending all this money for such a low return on the product? Not every child is hungry. So maybe if you think that there is a need there, focus on the kids in need, not give kids who would have had a well-off parents like myself. Like my kids would never have needed a food program. We were perfectly capable and they always had food, but our neighbor's kid might not have. And so I would rather take that 9 cents from my kids and maybe the 5 other families that have the food and give it to the one that doesn't, if that's the direction you want to go.
Right. So weird question. And I say this because I have an engineering background, a software background as well. Those are what I do for a living. I was thinking, is it possible right now, where we're at right now as a nation, just before we get to that apocalyptic future that you're warning about, God forbid, but is there a way to empirically measure what we call this decline? I looked online, and maybe just from my knowledge generally, I think maybe a VDEM or some other metrics, like a press freedom score. Is it possible to slowly measure that, say, over the next 4 years, 8 years, and see how we're doing as a nation?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly different freedom indexes. Actually, the Fraser Institute has a Freedom of the World Index. I think I would point to that. To what extent do you have a free society? To what extent do people get to make their own choices? I mean, ultimately, that's the most important thing for me. It's not that I dislike government 100% of the time or anything like that. It's that the government's there to make collective decisions, but not every decision is a collective decision. That we've got to be able to treat adults as adults. I get to make my choices, and sometimes they're going to get it right, and sometimes they're going to get it wrong, and I'm going to live with the consequences of my decisions. I don't know why that is so unbelievable for governments to accept them. And we saw that in COVID, right? That sure we agreed at the beginning that we would stay home. They said 2 weeks. It was a couple years, what's that between friends? But I remember like a year into it going, come on, like I am tired of being treated like a child. I know now how to keep myself safe. I hadn't gotten sick. Why is the state telling me how to live my life and micromanaging me? Like, think about it. We were micromanaged that we had to wear masks in places even if we didn't think it was safe. We were micromanaged that we couldn't drive. Like my son was learning how to drive at the time, and my husband took him to a parking lot to teach him how to park. And some bylaw officer came back and gave them heck because they weren't wearing masks in the car. And then when they said, well, we're just learning how to drive, then he got upset that he was even teaching him how to drive. There was nobody anywhere. And it was like, well, what if you're in an accident? And, it was crazy that the level of power the state felt that it could impose on adults, essentially.
You will quickly be tagged the right wing for saying that in this day and age, Dr. Miljan.
That's okay. I think I'd rather be called that than somebody who just wasn't critically evaluating. Again, I supported a lot of what the government did at the time, but I also think we needed to open things up. Once we had the vaccines, I think that those restrictions made no sense. And remember, we had those vaccines, and then we still had another year of restrictions.
So speaking of restrictions, I almost forgot this, but I think this is a very good last topic to chat about, actually. One of the things you mentioned in that article also was the Emergencies Act. And I think that's very important. You cited the Emergencies Act as an illustrative example of government overreach. Do you think the issue with the Freedom Convoy, you talking about excessive government hold and control during COVID, the Freedom Convoy protest stemmed from that. There's been a lot of controversies. Actually, let me say it like this. A lot of things have divided Canadians since the last decade. And I've lived in Canada for over a decade now, so I think I can speak to it both of experientially and even from reports. The 2015, when Trudeau's government came to power, it came on the grounds of, the white horse. A lot of people were optimistic, especially the younger and the older generation. Middle class, not so much. I don't even think they voted for him. By 2019, everyone was mad at the Romans that NDP and the Liberals had. And it never actually remained the same for Canadians since that time. 2020 came and worsened the feelings that people had about government because the same set of people almost like ganged up against Canadians. And then you had 2021 Freedom Convoy that further divided us as a nation. Those are the kind of things that the Trudeau administration never recovered from. And after that has been one thing after another, the further divided that divides us. Even issues about affordability right now still divides us because the political class thinks there's no problem, but the average person on the street is feeling an immense pain. To worsen all of that right now, you referenced this as a form of government decline. In fact, not a government decline, a decline of democracy. Would you say what we saw with the Freedom Convoy was a symptom, or do you think it was just a one-off exception?
I think what's problematic about it, I mean, at the time, I didn't agree with the Emergency Act, in part because for me, they didn't hit the threshold. The argument was it was hurting our economy, which made sense if you thought about what was happening at the border crossings at Coots here in Windsor. But you have to remember that a week before the Emergency Act was invoked, the provincial government declared a state of emergency and had cleared the protest in Windsor. So we had already had the police come in and were able to get rid of that protest in Windsor without invoking the Freedom Act. So to say, oh, we need to do it for Ottawa makes no sense because there's no economic argument. It wasn't that trucks weren't being able to pass a border in Ottawa. There's no border to pass. So we had already dealt with the border issue. And so this seemed punitive. It was a way to really stick it to the protesters because they were being annoying. And I totally appreciate that they were annoying, that they were loud and obnoxious. And yeah, nobody likes protesters. But you didn't need the Emergency Act. You could have used the existing tools that the state had under provincial and federal law to remove the protesters. And in a way, the city of, I think, the Ottawa Police Service aided and abetted the total disruption. They did not manage that problem. They didn't think it was going to, they didn't take it seriously enough, and then it got entrenched in. So there were lots of mistakes made. Fine. You have the inquiry absolves the government. But then there's this other court case, and the federal court justice, Richard Mosley, has now found he says that he felt that they did not meet the legal threshold for these extraordinary powers. And the government can't let that go. They are now appealing that decision. So they are doubling down on it. They want to ensure that they have those powers and that they can use it for this kind of thing. And I think that's what's dangerous, that they get to pick and choose which protest they find more annoying than another. I mean, we've had also a couple years now of anti-Israeli protests where these protesters, they don't entrench themselves. They don't sort of stay overnight anymore, though they were in this last summer in terms of universities, right? We didn't invoke the Emergency Act for universities that had campouts over the summer and restricting access to certain groups of people. We continue to have these protesters block traffic, do big public displays of prayer, screaming and yelling and escalating things, and the government's choosing not to do it there. So the question is, why are they picking and choosing which protesters to target? And is it just because a certain segment of protesters are more likely to vote for this government? But you don't want any government to have that power. Equally, you don't want them to be using Emergency Act if it's just a protest they disagree with. And so that's why I worry that this is going to the Supreme Court, because it might give government carte blanche into doing it whenever they feel like it.
So if this government was going to do anything reasonable compared to the previous government, what do you think they should be doing about that case currently?
They should just let the federal justice decision stand. They don't have to appeal it. They can just accept that justice has said that they hadn't met the legal threshold, because that way it then tells future governments that they have to abide by their own law. They can't just make stuff up, which is essentially what, the argument is, that from civil liberties groups, that they hadn't met the threshold, in part because they hadn't used all the tools available. If they could get rid of the protest in Windsor without invoking the Emergency Act, and that was an economic consequence, then why couldn't they use those same powers already available to them in Ottawa? Why did they have to impose the Emergency Act?
Which protest in Windsor are you referring to, by the way?
The same one. So the convoy, when the convoy was happening in Ottawa, they had other convoys happening in the Coutts border crossing in Alberta, and you had the Windsor border crossing. Basically, our border was shut for a couple weeks. It was awful. I agree. It was totally awful. I couldn't go to campus. You couldn't drive down there. It was total chaos and pandemonium. But the OPP got rid of it through the provincial powers.
Let's find our way home like this. We don't have sufficient time to get into your second article. I think we're going to get back into that another time. The next time we're meeting, I'm going to try really hard. I think I would like to do this in person. The podcast is growing, and I'm hoping there will be more resources. And I think there's a sense of having a more engaging conversation when it's in person than remotely. But, I'm just throwing it out there. But in your second article, which we don't have all the time to go into, your argument is that we're raising a generation that is becoming also indoctrinated socially. And some of these socio-cultural ideologies are being embedded into our K-12 system of education. I know we don't have time to delve into it, but I think the problem is this. We're raising the next generation who would not know how to appraise government, who would not know how to think critically as they ought to. And we have a media that stands in between government and the people and sabotages the people. It looks to me like, which one do we reform? Do we reform the K-12 system of education, or do we reform media? Which one do we even stand the chance to reform? And if we talk about reform also, with many of my colleagues who always talk about, oh, we should have a constitutional reform. I am often on the conservative side, like, let's just leave the constitution the way it is. I don't trust people to make reasonable reforms right now. And I think that's just me being cynical. But which one do we deal with? And which one's easier to reform, in fact? You get what I mean by the question?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a societal thing. Yeah, so the study you're talking about was we looked at the curriculum changes in K-12 just in Ontario, and I'm doing ones for other provinces as well. Actually, I'm working on BC right now. And what we were examining is the promise by Doug Ford back in 2018 when he ran for office that he said he was going to get rid of the social justice component that was being, he called, pushed in by the Wynne government. Discovery math and the sex education stuff, that kind of thing. Anyway, so we said, okay, well, let's see what you did. That was 2018. It's 2025. You reformed the curriculum. What's different? And there were a few positive things. They increased STEM, for example. They still do literacy stuff on the English language front. But it was worrisome because they didn't get rid of the social justice stuff. That they actually doubled down on it. They really emphasize social emotional learning, which again is fine. Like, you want your kids to feel good about learning, but they grade them on that. It's a bizarre assessment that you grade students on how they feel about math or social studies. And then the other thing is that they encourage cross-curricular, so it's sort of interdisciplinary, which kind of makes sense. But embedded in that is that you want to make them environmental stewards, and they're really doubling down on things like equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization. That they have to consciously disrupt racism, ableism, things like that. So that's a very much a social justice agenda. Again, I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it seemed to me reading that curriculum that they were still pushing one side of the argument, really emphasizing environmental justice and emphasizing climate change and not really engaging in the debate. And for me, for students to be able to critically evaluate stuff, they've got to know both sides of an argument. They can reject one, but they need to be able to see both sides and have the tools with how to be critical of them as opposed to just being fed one side. And then again, the point here is this is a progressive conservative government that had this happen. So, despite their campaign rhetoric, they certainly are still entrenched in the current education pedagogy and being directed by that interest group.
So again, back to the question, should we be looking at educational reform? Or what kind of a reform would you let's tie this together. How would you address this issue with a democratic decline right now? Should we be looking at reforms? How differently should we be thinking as a nation? Let's say you're in power. If you had all the executive power, what would you be tackling right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I don't get power. I guess I still am a classic liberal, and I think that it is only through our differences of opinions that we actually can come to good solutions. If we all agree on everything all the time, and if we're indoctrinating people to think the same, we're doing ourselves a disservice because we're not looking at alternative ways of interpreting the world. And again, I'm sure people in education are saying that's exactly what we're doing with our cultural emotional stuff. We're trying to be culturally sensitive and all that. But it almost, I would think that in the classroom, it probably has a chilling effect, much like it does in the media, that you're sort of being constrained with how you think. If we can learn as a society, and this might start with our education system, learn how to disagree, but do it in a respectful way. Think about alternative points of view, but still be able to maintain your argument or learn how to do a proper argument without name calling, without resorting to violence. I think we'll all do much better, both in the education system and in the media environment.
Right. So would you propose reforms as well, other than just the individual level of making changes?
Well, I guess in the education system, I would have liked to I was surprised what we found. I would have liked to see less of the sort of the new agey doublespeak. Those documents, I must say, I had to use AI to help me get through them because they're just so voluminous in terms of the words. And again, the Ford government said we want to go to back to basics education, and I don't think they did that. I think the back to basics education, if it was true reform, would be focusing on how to discern fact from fiction, how to read, how to multiply, add, divide, that kind of stuff, as opposed to including political debates in the classroom.
We're gonna come back and talk about this more in depth. And the very interesting thing was I was actually at an MLI conference just like 2 weeks ago. They invited me, and this was the marketplace of ideas where they were actually talking about the issue with diversity of thoughts, especially in academia, all the way from K-12 to tertiary institutions of learning. And there were a lot of insights that definitely that I gathered from there, and some of the problems that I wasn't even fully aware of before that has made me actually go back to study very well about them right now, and even understand the K-12 system of education, especially the governance, better. Maybe it's also becoming personal for me now that I'm a father in the course of time. I know I have to deal with that personally. But I think this is a conversation that's worth chatting about in a more thorough way. And we're going to come back to do that very soon. But it's been a great conversation. I think a little more relaxed this time as well. I hope you enjoyed it too. Did you?
I did. Well, thanks for having me.